Welcome to the inaugural episode in our new series of what we're calling The Spawn of Star Wars. These episodes will be posted every so often as we get the chance, interspersed with our normal fare of the past you never knew. The Spawn are considered any science fiction movie, some rushed to release, trying to capitalize on the craze Star Wars generated in the decade after its release. Whether inspired directly or indirectly by the plot, we'll be looking at what we consider some of the obscure or forgotten films from that time. Today we look at one of the first out of the gate, 1979 Starcrash. But to lay a groundwork for this and future episodes, we will also be looking at why Star Wars made such an impact at the time. And to do that, we need to give a short history of science fiction cinema leading up to 1977. In the end, our theory of why this was so should become clear. We'll see why the world was ready for an inspiring action-adventure that just happened to be sci-fi as well. Let's start by looking at a world before Star Wars. A world where, for the previous 10 years, the biggest budgets for a science fiction film were usually those that were considered cerebral or thought-provoking. That's not to say this was exclusive, but it was overall the norm. Action-oriented sci-fi usually had less money to work with, and were generally geared towards younger audiences. The root of this mindset? Well, that had to do with the impact of 2001: A Space Odyssey, varying attitudes from the general public, studio heads, and a production cycle that went back decades. Realistically, you could go back to the dawn of motion pictures, but for our purposes, we'll begin in the 20s, and the release of one of the first influential science fiction greats, Metropolis. It, better than most, marks what could be considered a grand cycle of sci-fi plots, and alternating between mainly action-adventure and cerebral or intellectual storylines by filmmakers. While Metropolis contained both types of subject matter, it could be said that it leaned a little more to an action-oriented side that was bolstered by an intellectual side. A decade later, 1936's Things to Come, based upon an H.G. Wells story, could be said to be heavily intellectual while containing adventure components. Jumping forward to 1951 with The Day the Earth Stood Still, and you get the beginning of an almost schizophrenic flip-flopping of subgenres throughout the decade and leading into the next. The Day the Earth Stood Still and Forbidden Planet were the high-water marks of the era, heavily intellectual yet sustained by selective action sequences. Add to that elements of suspense, and you've got the template for success for Hollywood in the 50s and beyond. Soon, studios began releasing more action-oriented films propped up by suspense, although more cheaply so. The result of this in the remaining decade was either B-movie fare or big-budget flicks with weak plots. Which leads us to the 60s in a film that will always be ranked up there with Star Wars. A film that can be said to have had a direct influence in both production value and the reverse of subject matter, which is none other than 2001: A Space Odyssey. Kubrick and Clark's masterpiece can be said to be the most brilliant of all intellectual sci-fi cinema. It set the tone in both style and plot for years, regardless of subject matter. Titles like Silent Running, The Andromeda Strain, and even Soylent Green dealt with much more adult and thought-provoking storylines than had been the usual fare. And action-packed flicks like Rollerball contained deeper undercurrents than what would have been previously contemplated. Yet Rollerball didn't have the special effects dazzle of 2001 and to a lesser extent Silent Running. Even the blockbuster Close Encounters of the Third Kind limited its sparkle throughout its story, saving it for a spectacular jaw-dropping ending. Even with its adventure, Close Encounters still remains cerebral at its heart. It would take Star Wars to combine action with higher production values and better special effects to move the science fiction genre to a place it was always striving for. If you're younger than 50, I'm sure it's hard to imagine the world just described. A world where up-tempo science fiction was almost exclusively low budget, didn't even have the pretense of a well-crafted story, and definitely lacked the saga that Star Wars contained. Now try and imagine a complete 180 in the span of one summer. By the end of 1978, a lot more science fiction was being made. The years leading up to 1977 had many without a science fiction movie, and then overnight those droughts became almost non-existent. By 1979, the foundations for sci-fi cinema as we know it were laying. So all of this leads us to Starcrash, Released in Europe in 1978, but not seen in the States until 1979. Billed as Barbarella meets Star Wars, it's evident today that the movie took much more inspiration from Star Wars than from a 60s space bimbo. Barbarella the movie, by the way, was released in 1968, just as 2001 was. It's just one example of many where science fiction films can reach the gamut and extremes of subject matter during the same year. A campy send-up based upon a French adult comic of the same name, Barbarella the film was lost in a translation of the mediums. But it does lead us to the first of many connections that star Caroline Munro had in her Starcrash role. As mentioned in our episode on the Golden Voyage of Sinbad, Munro's co-star John Philip Law also co-starred with Jane Fonda in Barbarella. It's almost as if Munro had to work with Law in order to be cast in Starcrash. Either that or some casting director made the connection subconsciously. It is evident that the designers for Starcrash were going for a Barbarella vibe in Munro's costumes, but that, I think, is about as far as you can go when comparing those two films. Starcrash had much more in common with Star Wars, as we'll see. Perhaps a synopsis is needed. Stella Star is an easygoing but extremely talented space pilot who's also a smuggler. Accompanied by Acton, her mysterious co-pilot and comrade-in-arms, they run across the survivor of a mysterious space catastrophe, the prelude of which leads us to the first of the Wars/Crash connections. Starcrash's opening scene, minus the laser blasts in pursuit, is a shoo-in for Star Wars's. I guess they figured, hey, it worked for them, it'll work for us. All we gotta do is leave out the space battle so it doesn't look like we're copying. Well anyways, shortly after Stella and Acton pick up the space castaway, they're nabbed by space cops Thor and Elle. Thor, a green-skinned alien, is portrayed by veteran stuntman and B-movie actor Robert Tessier. Elle, on the other hand, is a robot clearly modeled after Darth Vader, yet fills the niche of C-3PO. More on the weirdness that is Elle later. So Stella and Acton are sentenced to long space prison stretches by a green, tentacled head that had to have been an inspiration for Matt Groening's Kang and Kodos. In as brief a scene as possible, Stella helps lead a prison revolt and escapes, only to be picked up by Elle and Thor, who want her help with a matter of galactic importance, which is followed by an even briefer scene of Acton being released. This leads to an unexplained holographic meeting with the Emperor, played by Christopher Plummer, an actor who, by the way, seems to never be out of work. The Emperor wants them to find his son, who was one of the other survivors of the previously mentioned space catastrophe, and who is portrayed by David Hasselhoff in only his fourth role and second movie appearance. Throughout this adventure, we see the evil Count Zarth Arn, who just has evil intentions. The Count, better known as Joe Spinell, had a role in the first two Rocky flicks, but is best remembered by me for his role in the classic Forbidden Zone, a film that I hope to spotlight sometime soon on this channel. There's fun to be had on the Count's hand-shaped headquarters, with a pole to slide down and a bunch of marching for no apparent reason. Later we see the Amazon Queen directing a giant robot via laser lights coming out of her eyes. Made in the likeness of a metallic Amazon, the robot's prominent nipples look like they should be the ones shooting laser lights. Add to that acrobatic cavemen and what looks like a prop from Zardoz, and you get a generous take on European space campiness. The movie is obviously dubbed, but it's just as obvious that the actors were originally speaking English, which is odd considering the actors had to have their dialogue re-recorded for the American release. Remember I mentioned the weirdness that is Elle? Well, for some reason, they thought it would be a good idea for Elle to speak like a cowboy who doesn't use contractions, and who's always cracking a joke. Physically, Elle was portrayed by Caroline Munro's then-husband Judd Hamilton, who also did the character's original dialogue. Supposedly it was too expensive to fly Munro and Hamilton to Hollywood to re-record their dialogue, which is why Stella has an American accent portrayed by Candy Clark, and Elle sounds like a cowpoke. In one of those too true to be fiction moments, the voice actor chosen to be Elle's American voice was Hamilton Camp. Thus we get Hamilton and Hamilton as two parts of the same role. Both actors, according to some sources, were born in London but raised in the US. Hamilton Camp was a folk singer in the early 60s, while Judd Hamilton played in the band T-Bones with his brother Dan, who went on to become The Hamilton and Hamilton Joe Franken Reynolds, best known for Don't Pull Your Love and Fallen in Love. The only difference it seems is that Judd Hamilton's wife, for a while anyways, was a gorgeous actress, while Hamilton Camp's wasn't. The dialogue is just one of the things that makes Starcrash slightly cheesy. Take the space techno jargon for example. There are constant references to time and distance using terms that just don't make sense, or are contradictory. It's also readily apparent that the dialogue wasn't written by a native English speaker. You would think from the credits for screenplay and direction that one Lewis Coates would be up to the task, but Lewis Coates was in reality one Luigi Cozzi. Cozzi would later be known for a masterpiece in incongruous dubbing with the Hercules movies, starring Lou Ferrigno. Even the music was kind of half-assed. Best known for his James Bond scores, John Barry's soundtrack used many of the musical tricks he developed for the series. So much so that there are stretches that sound like they were pulled directly from a Bond film. I guess he just had Bond on the brain since he was fresh off The Spy Who Loved Me, which featured Monroe as a delectable villainess. After all this, you may think there's not much Star Wars ripping off going on here, but let me dispel you of that with the following. First we have Elle, who looks like Darth Vader, but speaks like a cowboy C-3PO and fills the same niche. Elle's apparent destruction and reassembly, Acton's laser swords, and death to become something more. And finally, an assault on the villain's base using space fighters. Some of those shots look like they were choreographed by the same person, if that person thought in 2 instead of 3 dimensions. The ships sometimes move at such ridiculous extreme angles that were they real, they would have killed their occupants. The various spacecraft are an anomaly also, some so well crafted that Cozzi couldn't help but linger on them both to fill time and to show off their craftsmanship, while others are so shoddily made that they utilize the original model sprues, parts and all, glued on slapdash to fill up voids. While all of this is laughable, Starcrash is still an enjoyable watch. It would definitely surpass some of the other Spawn that were yet to come. Given all of its warts, there's just enough of a story to hold your attention, suspending disbelief every time you think the cheese couldn't be sliced any thicker. In the greater history of science fiction cinema, Starcrash may be forgotten, but I think it should be remembered as one of the first to capitalize on a phenomenon, and not as badly as it could have been. Well, that does it for this episode. If you're interested in buying or renting any of the movies described in this episode, follow our links in the description to iTunes or Amazon. Making your purchases through our navigation helps to support AlterPast and is greatly appreciated. Be sure to subscribe to AlterPast and never miss an episode of the past you never knew. Also, give this video a like to show us that you think we're on the right track. Read a more in-depth account of the story in the original blog post at alterpast.wordpress.com. Thanks for watching. This is Will Carlson, and I'll see you in the AlterPast.